The sun filtered through the delicate lace curtains of the bridal suite, casting intricate patterns on the polished wooden floor. Grace sat in front of a large gilded mirror, her reflection radiant yet contemplative. Her hair was pinned in soft waves, adorned with a delicate veil that shimmered with the faintest touch of pearls. The wedding gown she wore fit like a dream, flowing around her in a cascade of silk and tulle. She traced the edge of the fabric absently, lost in the rhythm of her own breathing, a mix of nervous energy and anticipation swirling in her chest. Outside, the grounds of the estate buzzed with life. Laughter and chatter floated through the air as guests mingled, their bright attire dotting the lush green lawn. The scent of roses and lilies wafted in from the meticulously arranged floral arches, blending with the crisp autumn breeze. From her window, Grace could see her bridesmaids, a swirl of pastel dresses, coordinating final details with the wedding planner. The ceremony was set to begin in less than an hour, and every detail seemed perfect, at least on the surface. Grace's thoughts drifted as her fingers grazed a small gold locket hanging around her neck. Inside was a photo of her mother, whose absence was a tender ache she carried even on this joyful day. Her mother's warmth, her laughter, her words of advice, they were all missing. Yet, Grace felt her presence in the smallest moments, as if her mother were still guiding her somehow. The locket was her way of keeping her mother close, a silent reminder of the love that had shaped her life. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. Her maid of honor, Emily, peeked in, her smile wide and infectious. "Ready to become Mrs. Andrews?" Emily teased, stepping into the room with a gentle sway of her lilac dress. Grace laughed, a sound that seemed to ease some of the weight in her chest. She nodded and rose, smoothing the fabric of her gown as she did. "Almost," she replied, her voice steady but her hands betraying a slight tremor. Emily took one look at her and grabbed her hands. "You've got this." Andrew's head over heels, and today is going to be perfect. Grace's smile lingered even as Emily left a check on the final arrangements. The room grew quiet again, save for the faint hum of voices outside and the soft ticking of the antique clock on the wall. That's when Charlie padded into the room, his golden fur gleaming in the light. He was her constant companion, her protector, her anchor. At 9 years old, his movements were a little slower, but his eyes were still sharp and full of the loyalty that had defined their bond since the day her mother had brought him home as a puppy. "Hey, Charlie," she murmured, kneeling down to run her hands through his fur. His tail wagged softly, but there was something in his demeanor today that felt different. He nudged her hand with his nose, then whined a low, urgent sound. Grace tilted her head, puzzled. "What is it, boy? Are you excited for the big day, too?" Charlie didn't respond the way he usually would. Instead, he stood in front of her, his body stiff and alert. Grace chuckled nervously, brushing off the behavior as pre-wedding jitters for both of them. The bridal suite door opened again and Grace's father entered, his face a mix of pride and emotion. "You look just like your mother," he said, his voice thick with sentiment. He crossed the room to embrace her, holding her with a tenderness that nearly brought tears to her eyes. "She'd be so proud of you today." Grace smiled up at him, the weight of his words settling deep in her heart. Charlie stayed close, his head turning toward the doorway. His ears perked as if he were listening to something beyond the room. The moments leading up to the ceremony passed, in a blur of final touches and fleeting conversations. Grace adjusted her veil, checked her bouquet, and rehearsed her vows silently in her head. Her father offered his arm, and together they made their way toward the grand double doors leading to the garden, where rows of chairs and loved ones awaited. The sound of the string quartet drifted through the air, their melody soft and inviting. But just as they reached the top of the stairs, Charlie darted in front of them, blocking the way. He stood firm, his body a wall of determination, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity she had never seen before. Grace blinked in surprise, her grip tightening on her father's arm. "Charlie, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion. He barked a single, sharp sound that echoed in the hallway. Guests nearby turned their heads, their expressions a mix of curiosity and amusement. Her father bent down, trying to coax Charlie to move. "Come on, boy. Not the time for games." But Charlie didn't budge. Instead, he pawed at the hem of Grace's gown, his nails catching on the delicate fabric. Grace's heart skipped a beat, a flicker of unease creeping into her chest. She knelt again, smoothing the fabric as she met Charlie's gaze. "What is it, boy? What are you trying to tell me?" He whined again, and this time Grace noticed something she hadn't before: a small scrap of paper clutched in his mouth. It was old and crumpled, the edges torn as if it had been hidden away for years. Grace frowned, gently prying it from his jaws. Her hand shook as she unfolded the fragile sheet, her eyes scanning the faint, familiar handwriting. Her breath caught in her throat. It was her mother's. Time seemed to stop as she stared at the words, their meaning slow to register. A chill ran down her spine, her surroundings fading into a blur. The hallway grew impossibly quiet, Charlie's soft whine the only sound breaking the silence. Grace's hands trembled as she unfolded the crumpled paper, the edges soft and worn from age. The ink was faint, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was her mother's. The sight of those familiar loops and flourishes pulled at her heart, a bittersweet ache stirring memories of quiet evenings at the kitchen table, where her mother would write letters or notes with the same elegant script. Grace blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear the fog of disbelief that had settled over her mind. Charlie sat beside her, his golden fur brushing against the folds of her gown. He let out another soft whine, as though urging her to read. The moment was surreal. How had her dog found this? Where had it come from? The questions buzzed in her mind, but she pushed them aside, focusing instead on the words before her. "Dearest Grace," it began, the ink faint but legible. Her mother's voice seemed to echo in her mind as she read, filling the quiet hallway with an imagined warmth. "If you are reading this, it means that I am not there with you, though I wish I could be. I hope you know how much I love you and how proud I am of the woman you've become." Grace's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. She paused, her breath catching in her throat, before continuing. "There is something I must tell you, something I never had the chance to explain. It's a story I have kept close to my heart, not out of shame, but because I wanted to protect you from the burden of it. But now, as you stand on the brink of a new life, you deserve to know the truth." Her hands tightened around the paper as she read those words. Her mother's tone was gentle, yet the weight of what she was about to reveal felt heavy in Grace's chest. Charlie nudged her again, his soft brown eyes watching her intently, as if he understood the significance of the moment. The letter ended abruptly, the words cutting off mid-sentence. Grace turned the paper over, hoping for more, but the back was blank. She stared at it, confusion and frustration mingling with the knot of emotions in her chest. "That's it," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. What was she trying to tell me? Her father, who had been watching quietly, stepped closer. "What is it, Grace? What does it say?" he asked gently, his brow furrowed with concern. Grace hesitated. "It's a letter from Mom," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But it's incomplete." I don't know what she was trying to tell me. She handed him the paper, watching his expression shift as he read the words. He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with worry. "Do you think there's more of it somewhere?" Her mind raced. The letter felt like a piece of a puzzle, a key to something much larger, but she had no idea where to look for the rest. Then it struck her the chest. It had been her mother's most cherished possession, an antique wooden box lined with faded velvet, always locked and tucked away in the attic. Grace hadn't touched it since her mother's passing, unable to face the flood of memories it would bring. "I think I know where it might be," she said, standing abruptly. Her gown rustled as she moved, the heavy fabric momentarily tangling around her legs. She gathered it up and turned toward the stairs, her heart pounding. "I need to check something." Her father looked alarmed. "Grace, we don't have much time. The ceremony, this can't wait." she interrupted, her voice firm. "I need to know." Charlie followed closely as she climbed the stairs to the attic, his presence grounding her as her mind spun with possibilities. The attic was dimly lit, dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through the small, grimy window. The air smelled of aged wood and mothballs, a nostalgic scent that tugged at her senses. She spotted the chest almost immediately, tucked beneath an old quilt and surrounded by boxes of forgotten keepsakes. Her fingers brushed over the worn surface of the chest, the wood cool and smooth beneath her touch. She traced the intricate carvings on the lid, memories of her mother's hands doing the same flashing in her mind. The lock was intact, but the key had long been lost, or so she thought. Charlie barked softly, drawing her attention to the corner of the attic. He pawed at a small tin box, his tail wagging with quiet insistence. Grace opened the tin, her breath catching as she found the tiny brass key nestled inside. "Good boy, Charlie," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She knelt before the chest, the key fitting perfectly into the lock with a satisfying click. The lid creaked as she lifted it, revealing an array of neatly folded papers, photographs, and trinkets that had once belonged to her mother. She sifted through the items carefully, her hands trembling. Beneath a stack of old letters, she found what she was looking for, a folded sheet of paper that matched the one Charlie had brought her. Her heart raced as she unfolded it, her mother's handwriting once again coming into view. The second letter continued where the first had left off, and this time the tone was more serious. The words weighted with emotion. "There was a man who came into my life many years ago, a man who changed everything. His actions cost our family dearly, more than I can put into words. But it wasn't just his fault. He was part of something bigger, something I tried to shield you from. I never wanted this burden to touch your life, Grace, but now it seems inevitable. You deserve to know the truth, even if it hurts." Grace's hands tightened around the paper as she read, her pulse quickening. Who was her mother talking about? What could have been so devastating that she had kept it hidden all these years? The letter mentioned a name, faint but legible, Andrews. Her breath caught. Andrews, the name of the man she was about to marry, the name that would soon be her own. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories and moments, things her mother had said but never explained. Could this be a coincidence? Or was there something deeper, something she had never imagined? Charlie nudged her again, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked down at him, his steady gaze grounding her as she tried to process the revelation. The attic seemed to close in around her, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her chest. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her lap, her hands shaking. Her father's voice called from the stairs, breaking the silence. "Grace, are you all right? What's going on up there?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to answer. "I found it," she said, her voice barely audible. "I found the rest of the letter." The truth hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. Grace knew she couldn't walk down the aisle without confronting what she had just learned. The answers she had sought were now before her, but they only raised more questions. Andrews. The name echoed in her mind, a shadow falling over the happiest day of her life. She folded the letter and stood, determination hardening her resolve. Whatever the truth was, she had to face it, and she had to face Andrew. Grace stood in the dim attic, clutching the letters to her chest, her thoughts a tangled mess. The faint scent of old paper and cedar filled the air, grounding her in the present even as her mind raced to the past. The letters her mother had written were like ghosts of another time, whispering truths she had never imagined. She held the folded sheets tightly, her gaze drifting to the chest before her. There were more papers inside, layers of history preserved by her mother, waiting to be uncovered. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she reached for the next set of documents. Charlie sat beside her, his golden fur brushing against her arm, as if he knew she needed his steadying presence. Her father stood at the edge of the attic stairs, his concerned voice breaking the silence. "Grace, are you sure this is what you want to do right now?" Everyone is waiting downstairs. Grace turned to him, her eyes wide with urgency. "I have to know," she said softly, her voice barely steady. "I can't go into this blind. Mom wanted me to find this. She left it for me." Her father hesitated, his lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded, stepping back to give her space. Inside the chest, Grace found a small stack of yellowed photographs bound with a faded ribbon. She untied it carefully, her breath catching as she flipped through the images. They were of her mother, smiling and carefree, a younger version of the woman Grace had always known. But the man standing beside her mother in many of the photos wasn't her father. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority. In one image, he had his arm around her mother, his expression serious yet warm. Grace frowned, flipping the photo over. Her mother's elegant handwriting was scrawled on the back. Joseph Andrews, 1991. Her stomach tightened. Andrews. The name loomed larger now, no longer a coincidence. She remembered her mother mentioning a Joseph Andrews once, years ago, in passing. It had been during a rare moment of vulnerability, when her mother had spoken about a difficult time in her life, though she had offered no details. Grace hadn't pressed her then. She hadn't thought much of it. But now, it was clear that Joseph Andrews wasn't just a figure from her mother's past. He was the father of the man she was about to marry. The realization struck her like a thunderbolt, leaving her breathless. She flipped through the remaining photographs, each one a small fragment of a story she was only beginning to piece together. In some, her mother and Joseph stood with a group of other people, colleagues, perhaps, or friends. But there was one image that stood out. A grainy photo of her mother and Joseph standing in front of a grand, unfamiliar house. Her mother's smile was radiant, but Joseph's expression was more subdued, almost somber. Written on the back of this photo were the words Andrews Manor. Grace sifted through the papers beneath the photographs, finding more letters, some addressed to her mother and others written by her. They spoke of a business deal gone wrong, of betrayal and loss, though the details were vague. One letter, written in her mother's handwriting, was particularly striking. "Joseph," it began, "I trusted you, and you destroyed everything. I don't know how to forgive you for what you've done not just to me, but to my family. The weight of your decisions is unbearable, and the consequences have left me shattered. I cannot allow Grace to be caught in this web of lies and betrayal. She deserves better." Grace's heart pounded as she read those words. Her mother had trusted this man, only to have that trust broken. And now, decades later, Grace was about to marry his son. The thought made her feel as if the walls of the attic were closing in on her. She needed answers, and she needed them now. She carefully placed the letters and photographs back in the chest, taking only her mother's notes and the photograph of Andrews Manor with her. Charlie followed her as she descended the stairs, her father trailing behind, his face lined with worry. "Grace, what did you find?" he asked, his voice hushed. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, turning to him with tears in her eyes. "Mom knew Joseph Andrews," she said, her voice shaking. "He's Andrews' father. And something happened between them, something that hurt her deeply. I don't know the whole story, but I need to find out." Her father's expression darkened. "Joseph Andrews," he muttered almost to himself. "I remember him. Your mother never told me much, but I knew they had a falling out. I didn't know it went this deep." Grace nodded, her resolve hardening. "I have to talk to Andrew. He has to know about this, and I need to hear his side. If he's been keeping something from me, I can't just walk down that aisle pretending everything is fine." She found Andrew in the library, pacing nervously as the final preparations for the ceremony continued outside. He turned when he saw her, his face lighting up momentarily before falling into concern. "Grace, what's wrong? You're pale. Is everything okay?" She stepped into the room, clutching the letters in her hand. Charlie stayed close, his presence a silent support. "Andrew," she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "We need to talk. Now." Andrew's brow furrowed as he moved toward her. Of course. What's going on? Grace held up the letters and photograph. Do you know what this is? She asked, her voice firm. He glanced at the items, his confusion evident. No, should I? Her grip tightened on the papers. This is a letter from my mother, written years ago, and a photograph of her with your father. Andrew, why didn't you tell me they knew each other? Why didn't you tell me there was a connection between our families? Andrew froze, his face going pale. For a long moment he said nothing, his silence speaking volumes. Finally he sighed, running a hand through his hair. Grace, I didn't know how to tell you, he said quietly. I found out about it a few years ago, after my father passed away. He left behind journals, letters, things that mentioned your mother. I didn't want to dig into it, and I didn't want to hurt you. Grace stared at him, her chest tightening. So you knew, she said, her voice trembling. You knew there was something between them, and you didn't think I deserved to know? Andrew looked pained. It wasn't like that, he insisted. I didn't know the details, Grace. I still don't. All I know is that my father made some mistakes, big ones, and your mother was caught in the middle. I didn't want to bring up something that might ruin what we have. Grace shook her head, the weight of his words sinking in. Andrew, this isn't just some old grudge. My mother was hurt, betrayed by your father. And now I'm standing here, about to marry you, not knowing if this is something we can overcome. Andrew stepped closer, his eyes pleading. Grace, I love you. Whatever happened between our parents, it doesn't change how I feel about you. We're not them. We can start fresh, build something better. Grace looked down at the letters in her hand, her mind racing. The truth was painful, but Andrew's words held a glimmer of hope. She didn't know if she could forgive him for keeping this from her, but she also couldn't ignore the love they had shared. I need time to think, she said finally, her voice breaking. I can't make this decision right now. Andrew nodded, his face etched with sorrow. Take all the time you need, he said softly. I'll be here, waiting for you. As Grace left the room, Charlie at her side, she felt a strange mix of clarity and confusion. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the picture they formed was far from complete. She needed to decide if she could move forward with Andrew if the past was too much to overcome. For now, all she could do was hold on to the truth and let her heart guide her next steps. Grace stood outside the library doors, her pulse pounding in her ears. The weight of the letters in her hand felt heavier than ever, as if they carried the full force of her mother's pain and unresolved history. She had never been one to avoid difficult conversations, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about her, it was about her family, Andrew, and the life she had thought they were building together. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and pushed the door open. Andrew was pacing again, his tuxedo jacket slightly wrinkled from his nervous movements. He turned quickly at the sound of the door, relief washing over his face when he saw her. Grace, he said, his voice filled with hope. Thank God. I was worried. She held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. We need to talk. Sit down. Her tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. Andrew's expression shifted to one of concern. He nodded and moved to the sofa, sitting on the edge, his posture tense. Grace remained standing, clutching the letters like a lifeline. Charlie trotted in behind her and sat at her feet, his steady gaze a comforting presence. She placed the letters and photograph on the coffee table between them. These are for my mother, she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. I found them this morning with Charlie's help, and they've raised questions I never thought I'd have to ask. Andrew leaned forward, his brows knitting as he studied the papers. His gaze lingered on the photograph, recognition flickering in his eyes. He swallowed hard, but said nothing. Why didn't you tell me? Grace's voice broke the silence, trembling slightly. You knew our parents were connected. You knew there was history between them. Why didn't you think I deserved to know? Andrew exhaled slowly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I didn't know how to tell you, he admitted, his voice low. I only found out a couple of years ago, after my father died. He left behind journals and letters, and your mother's name came up in them. I didn't know what to do with the information. You didn't know what to do with it. Grace's voice rose, anger seeping into her words. Andrew, this isn't just some irrelevant piece of trivia. My mother trusted your father, and he betrayed her. That betrayal had consequences for my family, consequences that shaped my entire life. And you kept it from me. Andrew ran a hand through his hair, his expression anguished. I didn't want to hurt you, he said. I thought if I brought it up, it would complicate things unnecessarily. What happened between our parents isn't our fault, Grace. It's their past, not ours. Grace shook her head, her frustration mounting. It's not just their past, Andrew. It's my past, too. My mother left me these letters because she wanted me to know the truth. She wanted me to understand what happened. And now I'm standing here, trying to make sense of all this while you sit there, acting like it doesn't matter. It does matter, Andrew said sharply, standing up. It matters to me, too. But I love you, Grace. I didn't want something that happened decades ago to ruin what we have now. I didn't want it to define us. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Grace's chest ached with the weight of her emotions, love, anger, betrayal, confusion, all swirling together in a chaotic storm. She looked down at the photograph, at the image of her mother and Joseph Andrews, standing in front of that grand house. The pain in her mother's letters echoed in her mind, mingling with Andrew's pleas for understanding. I don't know if I can do this, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew's face fell. Grace, please. Don't let this come between us. I know I should have told you. I was wrong, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. But don't let something my father did destroy what we built together. Grace stared at him, searching his face for answers, for some reassurance that their love could withstand this revelation. But all she saw was his own struggle, his own pain. You say it's not our fault, she said quietly, but it feels like it is now. Because you didn't tell me the truth. You didn't trust me enough to let me decide for myself. Andrew stepped closer, his hands reaching for hers. I was scared, he admitted. Scared that it would change how you saw me, how you saw us. And now I see that keeping it from you was a mistake. But Grace, I need you to know that I love you. That hasn't changed, and it never will. Grace pulled her hands away, her heart aching at the sight of him. I need time, she said firmly. I can't make a decision right now. I need to think, to process everything. Andrew nodded, his shoulders slumping. Take all the time you need, he said softly. I'll be here, waiting for you. She turned and left the library, her mind racing. As she walked through the quiet hallways of the estate, Charlie at her side, she felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. The confrontation had given her some answers, but it had also left her with even more questions. Could she move forward with Andrew, knowing what she now knew? Or was this the end of the life she had imagined with him? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was certain: Grace couldn't walk down that aisle until she had found them. Grace sat in the quiet solitude of the estate's garden, her gown spread out around her like a pool of ivory silk. The autumn breeze tugged at her veil, carrying the faint scent of roses and lavender from the nearby flower beds. She clutched her mother's letters in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of the fragile paper, as if it could somehow guide her to the answers she so desperately needed. The weight of the day pressed down on her, heavier than the fabric of her dress or the expectations of the people waiting just inside the estate. Her mind was a whirlpool of emotions: love for Andrew, betrayal at his omission, confusion over the revelations about their families, and a deep ache of longing for her mother's voice. How had it come to this? On a day meant to be the happiest of her life. Charlie lay at her feet, his presence as steady and grounding as ever. He let out a soft whine, his soulful eyes meeting hers. Grace reached down and ran her fingers through his fur, drawing comfort from his warmth. "What do I do, boy?" she murmured. How do I move forward from this? She looked at the letters again, rereading her mother's words. The pain in the handwriting was unmistakable, a reflection of the burden her mother had carried alone for so many years. The betrayal had cut deep, but there was something else in the words, to an undercurrent of forgiveness, or at least an acknowledgement that the past could not be undone. Grace closed her eyes and thought about her mother. She thought about the strength it must have taken to move forward after what had happened, to protect Grace and give her the life she deserved. Her mother's love had always been unwavering, a constant in a world full of uncertainties. And now, even in her absence, her mother had found a way to reach her, to guide her when she needed it most. The sound of footsteps on gravel pulled Grace from her thoughts. She turned to see her father approaching, his expression filled with concern. He hesitated for a moment before sitting beside her on the stone bench. "I thought I'd find you here," he said gently. Grace managed a small smile. "It's where I always go when I need to think." Her father nodded, his gaze drifting to the letters in her lap. "You've been through a lot today," he said. "More than anyone should have to deal with on a day like this." Grace exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her emotions. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "I love Andrew, but I don't know if I can trust him after this. And what if the past is too much for us to overcome? What if it's a sign that we're not meant to be?" Her father was quiet for a moment, his hands clasped in front of him. "Grace," he said finally, his voice steady and reassuring, "love isn't about finding someone who comes with no baggage. It's about deciding if you're willing to carry it with them. Andrew made a mistake, there's no denying that. But mistakes don't have to define a person or a relationship. What matters is what you both choose to do moving forward." Grace looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. But what if the past keeps coming back? What if it ruins everything? Her father reached for her hand, his grip firm and comforting. "The past only has as much power as you give it," he said. "Your mother taught me that. She carried a lot of pain, but she also found a way to let go of it, to focus on what mattered most, her love for you and the future she wanted for you. That's what she would want you to do now. To choose the life you want, not the one defined by someone else's mistakes." Grace nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude for his words. She leaned into his shoulder, letting herself feel the comfort of his presence. For a moment, the weight on her chest seemed to lift, replaced by a small spark of clarity. After her father left, Grace remained in the garden, turning over his words in her mind. She thought about Andrew, about the man she had fallen in love with, who had made her laugh when no one else could, who had held her through life's storms. She thought about the way he had looked at her earlier, his eyes filled with regret and love. And she thought about her mother's words, about the importance of forgiveness and the strength it took to move forward. Finally, Grace stood, smoothing the folds of her gown. She tucked the letters back into the envelope, holding them close to her heart for a moment before placing them in the pocket sewn into her dress. Charlie wagged his tail, sensing her determination. "It's time," she said softly, and together they made their way back to the estate. Inside, the buzz of the wedding preparations was muted, as if the entire house was holding its breath. Grace found Andrew in the room where they had last spoken. He stood by the window, staring out at the garden, his posture tense. When he heard her footsteps, he turned, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. "Grace," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't know if you'd come back." She walked toward him, her steps slow but deliberate. "I had a lot to think about," she said, "and I've made a decision." Andrew's face paled slightly, but he nodded, bracing himself. "Whatever it is, I'll respect it." Grace stopped in front of him, meeting his gaze. "I love you," she said simply. "That hasn't changed. But trust is something we're going to have to rebuild together. You should have told me the truth from the beginning, Andrew. But I also understand why you were afraid." Andrew's shoulders sagged in relief, his eyes glistening with emotion. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, Grace. I promise." She placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "We can't change the past," she said, "but we can choose what we do with it. And I choose us. I choose to believe that we're stronger than this, that we can build a future together." Andrew's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close. She felt the tension in his body melt away as he held her, and for the first time that day, she felt a sense of peace. Charlie barked softly, and they both laughed, the sound breaking through the heaviness that had lingered between them. "Let's get married," Grace said, pulling back to look into Andrew's eyes. "Let's start our life together, not as the children of our parents, but as our own people." Andrew smiled, his relief and love shining through. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady and sure. Together, they walked to the ceremony, hand in hand. The guests rose as Grace entered, Charlie trotting beside her with his tail wagging proudly. The air was filled with love and hope, and as Grace looked at Andrew, she knew she had made the right choice. The past would always be there, but it didn't have to define their future. They would build something new together. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the estate's garden in hues of gold and amber, Grace sat on a wooden bench beneath the sprawling oak tree where she had often played as a child. Her wedding gown was still pristine, a symbol of the future she had chosen, but her thoughts felt heavy with the weight of the morning's revelations. Charlie lay at her feet, his warm presence grounding her as the events of the day replayed in her mind. The decision to confront Andrew had been one of the hardest moments of her life. While she believed in their love, the truths about their family's interconnected past hung between them like a shadow. She had made the choice to marry him, but now, in the quiet moments before the ceremony began, she wondered if love alone could be enough to overcome the legacy of pain and betrayal that had shaped their lives. A soft rustling in the distance caught her attention, and she looked up to see her father approaching. His face was etched with concern, his steps careful as he crossed the garden to join her. He carried a small box in his hands, its worn edges suggesting it had been hidden away for years. "I thought you might want this," he said, sitting beside her and placing the box on the bench between them. Grace frowned, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Her father hesitated, his gaze fixed on the box. "Your mother left it for you," he said finally. "I didn't know when the right time would be to give it to you, but after what you found this morning, I think now is that time." Grace's breath caught as she reached for the box, her fingers trembling. She lifted the lid slowly, revealing a collection of items that seemed to hold echoes of her mother's life: a delicate handkerchief embroidered with her initials, a silver locket, and a small stack of letters tied with a ribbon. Beneath them was a journal, its leather cover worn but intact. Her father gestured toward the journal. "She started writing in it not long after the fallout with Joseph Andrews," he said. "She told me once that it was her way of making sense of everything, of trying to move forward." Grace opened the journal carefully, the scent of aged paper wafting up to meet her. The handwriting inside was unmistakably her mother's, elegant and precise, yet filled with an emotional weight that seemed to leap off the page. She began to read, her father sitting quietly beside her, offering his silent support. The journal entries painted a picture of a woman grappling with heartbreak and resilience. Grace's mother had poured her thoughts onto the pages, recounting the trust she had placed in Joseph Andrews, the betrayal that followed, and the devastating impact it had on her family. But interspersed with the pain were moments of hope, reflections on her love for Grace, her determination to rebuild her life, and her belief in the power of forgiveness. One passage stood out to Grace. "People are not defined by the worst thing they've done, but by how they choose to move forward. I've learned that forgiveness is not about excusing someone's actions. It's about freeing yourself from the hold they have over you. I can't change what happened with Joseph, but I can choose to let it shape me differently. For Grace, I will be strong. For her, I will find peace." Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she closed the journal, her heart aching with both grief and gratitude. Her mother's words were a reminder that while the past could not be undone, it didn't have to dictate the future. She looked at her father, her voice trembling. She was so strong. She was, her father agreed, his own eyes glistening. And she would want you to be strong too, to make the choices that bring you happiness, not just the ones that are easy. Grace nodded, the journal still clutched in her hands. I think I understand now, she said softly. Why she left this for me. She wanted me to see that forgiveness is possible, even when it feels impossible. Her father placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She believed in you, Grace, and so do I. As the ceremony time drew nearer, Grace knew she needed to speak with Andrew again. She couldn't walk down the aisle without sharing what she had found, without giving him a chance to understand the depth of what their family's histories meant to her. With Charlie trotting faithfully at her side, she made her way back to the library where Andrew had been waiting. When she entered, Andrew rose immediately, his expression a mixture of worry and hope. Grace, he said, his voice tentative, I didn't think you'd come back. She took a deep breath, holding the journal against her chest. I needed time to think, she said, her tone steady. And I needed to understand more about my mother, about your father, and about how we move forward from here. Andrew nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. I'll do whatever it takes, he said. Just tell me what you need. Grace stepped closer, placing the journal on the table between them. This is my mother's journal, she said. It's her story, in her own words. She wrote about the pain your father caused her, but she also wrote about forgiveness, about how it's not about excusing someone's actions, but about finding peace for yourself. Andrew looked at the journal, his brow furrowed. I want to understand, he said. I want to know everything about her, about what happened, and about how we can move forward together. Grace nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. Then let's read it together, she said. Let's learn from her story, and let's figure out what it means for us. They spent the next several hours poring over the journal's pages, sharing in the emotions and insights Grace's mother had left behind. There were moments of silence, moments of tears, and moments of quiet reflection. But through it all, Grace felt a sense of connection growing between them, a shared determination to honor the past while building a future that was truly their own. By the time they finished, the sun had set, and the estate was aglow with twinkling lights in preparation for the ceremony. Grace closed the journal, her heart full but steady. She looked at Andrew, who had been watching her with an intensity that made her feel both vulnerable and safe. I'm ready, she said softly, to move forward. With you. Andrew reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. I promise, he said, to be honest with you, to stand by you, and to work through whatever comes our way. You're my everything, Grace. Her heart swelled as she leaned into him, their foreheads touching. For the first time that day, she felt a true sense of peace and certainty that they could face the challenges ahead together. As the ceremony began, Grace walked down the aisle with a renewed sense of purpose. Her father's words, her mother's journal, and Andrew's love had given her the clarity she needed to embrace the future. Charlie trotted beside her, his presence a symbol of the loyalty and unconditional love that had guided her through the day. When she reached Andrew at the altar, she saw her own determination reflected in his eyes. Together, they had faced a reckoning of their past, and together, they would build something new, something stronger than the shadows that had once threatened to tear them apart. The vows they exchanged were more than promises. They were declarations of resilience, trust, and hope. And as they sealed their union with a kiss, Grace knew that their story was just beginning. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be theirs, and that was enough. The moment Grace stepped into the garden, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. The warm autumn sunlight bathed the space in a golden glow, setting the scene for what should have been the happiest day of her life. Her heart was still heavy with the weight of the morning's revelations, but now it was tempered by clarity, a sense of purpose. Her father stood beside her, his arm looped through hers, offering a steadying presence. At her feet, Charlie padded along, his head held high as if he, too, understood the significance of the moment. The aisle stretched before her, lined with rows of chairs draped in white, and adorned with delicate garlands of roses and eucalyptus. Guests turned to watch her, their faces alight with anticipation. The string quartet played softly, the melody weaving through the air like a thread of magic. Grace's steps were measured, deliberate, as she moved toward Andrew, who stood waiting beneath an arch of flowers. His eyes found hers instantly, and the intensity in his gaze sent a wave of emotion crashing over her. For a brief moment, everything else fell away: the history, the pain, the uncertainty. All that mattered was the man standing at the end of the aisle, his love for her written plainly on his face. Grace tightened her grip on her father's arm as they approached, her heart pounding in her chest. When they reached the altar, her father turned to her, his eyes brimming with pride. He kissed her forehead softly and whispered, "You're making the right choice." She smiled at him, her throat tight with emotion, before stepping forward to join Andrew. Andrew's hands trembled slightly as he took hers, his touch warm and reassuring. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of the morning's events reflected in their shared gaze. There were no words that could encompass everything they were feeling. So they let the silence speak for them, a quiet promise that they would face whatever came next together. The officiant began to speak, her voice steady and soothing as she welcomed everyone and spoke of love, commitment, and the beauty of two lives becoming one. Grace listened, but her focus remained on Andrew, the man she had chosen to build her future with despite the shadows of the past. She could see the love in his eyes, the unspoken apology, the determination to be better. It steadied her, gave her the strength to move forward. When the time came for the vows, Grace took a deep breath and began. Her voice wavered at first, but as she spoke, her confidence grew. "Andrew," she said, her gaze locked with his, "when I met you, I didn't just find someone to love. I found someone who made me laugh, who challenged me, and who showed me what it means to truly be seen. Today, I choose you not because we're perfect, but because we're imperfect together, and that's what makes us strong. I promise to love you, to trust you, and to work with you to build a life that honors both the good and the difficult moments. You are my partner, my best friend, and my home. I choose you today and every day." Andrew's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his grip on her hands tightening. He took a moment to compose himself before speaking, his voice thick with emotion. "Grace," he began, "you are the light in my life, the person who makes everything brighter and better just by being there. I know I haven't always made the right choices, but loving you has been the easiest, truest choice I've ever made. I promise to honor you, to be honest with you, and to never stop trying to be the man you deserve. Today, I vow to stand by your side, to face life's challenges with you, and to love you with everything I have. You are my heart, my forever, and my greatest gift." Tears streamed down Grace's face as he finished, her heart swelling with love and hope. The officiant smiled warmly, guiding them through the exchange of rings. As Andrew slipped the band onto her finger, she felt the weight of the moment settle around her, not a burden, but a promise, solid and unyielding. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Andrew pulled her close, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both tender and fierce, a declaration of their love and their determination to move forward together. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, the sound echoing through the garden as confetti rained down around them. As they turned to face their friends and family, Charlie barked happily, drawing laughter from the guests. Grace bent down to ruffle his fur, her smile wide and genuine. "You've been with me through everything, haven't you, boy?" she said softly. Charlie wagged his tail, his excitement infectious. The reception that followed was a blur of laughter, music, and celebration. The estate's ballroom had been transformed into a space of understated elegance, with soft lighting, cascading floral arrangements, and tables adorned with fine china and candles. Guests toasted to the happy couple, sharing stories and well wishes that filled the room with warmth. Grace and Andrew shared their first dance as husband and wife, swaying to a melody that seemed to capture the essence of their journey. As they moved together, Grace felt the tension of the day melting away, replaced by a deep sense of peace. She rested her head against Andrew's chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek. "I love you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. Andrew kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. "I love you too," he replied, "and I promise we'll make this work, no matter what." The night continued with joy and revelry, the shadows of the past momentarily forgotten in the glow of celebration. But even as they laughed and danced, Grace knew the challenges ahead wouldn't disappear overnight. Trust would need to be rebuilt, wounds would need to heal, and conversations would need to be had. But for the first time all day, she felt confident in her ability to face it all with Andrew by her side. As the evening wound down, Grace found herself standing outside with Charlie, the cool air brushing against her skin. The stars above were bright and clear, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the endless possibilities that lay ahead. She knelt down beside Charlie, wrapping her arms around him. "We did it, boy," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "We made it through." Charlie wagged his tail, his eyes reflecting the starlight. Grace smiled, feeling a sense of closure as she looked toward the future. The past would always be a part of her story, but it didn't have to define her. She had chosen love, and in that choice, she had found her strength. When she returned inside, Andrew was waiting for her, his hand outstretched. She took it without hesitation, letting him lead her back into the warmth and light of their celebration. Together, they stepped into their new beginning, ready to face whatever came next. After the wedding, life didn't settle into the peaceful routine Grace and Andrew had hoped for, not immediately anyway. The joy of their union was tempered by the unresolved threads of their pasts, and while their love was strong, it was clear that healing wasn't something that could happen overnight. The first few weeks were an emotional whirlwind, filled with difficult conversations, moments of doubt, and small victories that gave them hope. Grace knew she had chosen the right path by marrying Andrew, but the shadows of their parents' history lingered. Her mother's letters and the betrayal they hinted at still sat heavily in her mind, and she often found herself replaying her mother's words, trying to untangle the emotions they stirred. Meanwhile, Andrew grappled with his own guilt and fear, questioning whether he could truly be the partner Grace deserved. It was one quiet evening in their new home that Grace decided they couldn't keep tiptoeing around the issue. The fireplace crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the living room, and Charlie lay sprawled on the rug, snoring gently. Grace sat beside Andrew on the couch, their hands loosely intertwined, but the weight of unspoken thoughts filled the air. "We need to talk about your father," Grace said finally, her voice steady but soft. Andrew stiffened slightly, his gaze dropping to their joined hands. "I figured we would," he said after a moment. "I just didn't know when or how to bring it up." Grace turned to face him, her expression kind but resolute. "We can't move forward without addressing it, Andrew. I don't want there to be any more secrets between us. Whatever happened between him and my mother, I need to understand it." Andrew nodded, exhaling slowly. "You're right," he said. "I owe you the truth, and I owe it to myself to face it, too." Over the next few days, they began unraveling the story together. Andrew brought out the journals and letters his father had left behind, documents he had once avoided out of fear of what they might reveal. Together, they sifted through the papers, piecing together a narrative that was more complex and painful than either of them had expected. Joseph Andrews had been a man of ambition, driven by a desire for success and recognition. In his younger years, he had entered into a business venture with Grace's mother, a partnership that had seemed promising at first but ultimately ended in disaster. The letters revealed a series of poor decisions and moral compromises on Joseph's part-cutting corners, breaking promises and prioritizing profit over loyalty. When the venture collapsed, it left Grace's mother financially and emotionally devastated, forcing her to rebuild her life from scratch. But the story wasn't as black and white as it had seemed. In some of the letters, Joseph expressed regret and guilt, acknowledging the harm he had caused and wishing he could make amends. He wrote of his admiration for Grace's mother, of the respect he had for her resilience and integrity. It was clear that he had wrestled with his choices until the end of his life. For Grace, reading these letters was both painful and cathartic. They didn't erase the hurt her mother had endured, but they added layers of complexity to the narrative. Joseph Andrews wasn't just a villain. He was a flawed human being who had made mistakes and carried the weight of them for years. Grace began to see parallels between his story and her own, a reminder that people weren't defined solely by their worst moments. For Andrew, the process was equally transformative. He had spent much of his life idolizing his father, only to have that image shattered when he discovered the truth. But now, with Grace by his side, he found himself reevaluating his father's legacy. Joseph had been far from perfect, but he had also been capable of reflection and remorse. Andrew realized that part of his journey was learning to accept his father's humanity without letting it dictate his own sense of self. As they worked through the letters, Grace and Andrew began to talk more openly about their fears and vulnerabilities. Grace shared stories about her mother, her strength, her kindness, and the lessons she had imparted. Andrew, in turn, spoke of his father's charm and intelligence, qualities that had made him a formidable but complicated figure in his life. These conversations brought them closer, helping them to see each other in new ways and to appreciate the depth of their connection. One evening, as they sat together on the couch with the last of the letters spread out on the coffee table, Andrew reached for Grace's hand. "I'm sorry for what my father did to your mother," he said quietly, "and I'm sorry for not telling you the truth sooner. I was scared of what it would mean for us, but I should have trusted you." Grace squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with empathy. "I forgive you," she said, "and I think my mother would forgive your father, too, if she were here. She was always stronger than I realized, and I think she'd want us to find peace." Andrew nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "I want that too," he said, "for both of us." In the weeks that followed, Grace and Andrew took steps to honor their family's legacies while forging a path of their own. They decided to visit Andrew's manor, the house that had appeared in the photograph Grace had found on her wedding day. It was a sprawling estate, now abandoned, overgrown with ivy and weathered by time. Walking through its halls was like stepping into the past, and both of them felt the weight of history pressing down on them. In one of the dusty rooms, they found an old desk with a drawer that still held papers and photographs. Among them was a letter addressed to Grace's mother, written in Joseph's unmistakable hand. It was a letter he had never sent, one that spoke of his deep regret and his hope that she would someday find happiness despite the pain he had caused. Reading it brought tears to Grace's eyes, but it also gave her a sense of closure. When they left Andrew's manor, Grace felt lighter, as if she were leaving behind a burden she had carried for far too long. She and Andrew stood together on the overgrown lawn, the sun setting behind them, and promised to keep moving forward with honesty and love. Back at home, Grace found herself thinking about her mother's letters again. She decided to start writing letters of her own, not just to her mother, but to her future self, to Andrew, and to the children they hoped to have one day. She wanted to leave behind a legacy of love and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of pain and uncertainty, it was possible to find joy and hope. One evening, as she wrote by the fire, Andrew joined her, a cup of tea in hand. He sat beside her, glancing at the journal she was filling with words. "What are you writing about?" he asked, his voice curious but gentle. Grace smiled, setting her pen down. "About us," she said. "About everything we've been through and everything we've learned. I want to remember it, all the good and the bad." Andrew nodded, his hand resting on hers. "I think that's beautiful," he said. "And I think your mother would be proud." As the fire crackled and the room filled with warmth, Grace felt a deep sense of gratitude. The journey to reconciliation hadn't been easy, but it had brought her and Andrew closer than ever. Together, they had faced their fears, embraced their imperfections, and found a way to move forward with love and understanding. Their story wasn't perfect, but it was there's a testament to the power of forgiveness, the strength of resilience, and the beauty of choosing love, even when it wasn't easy. The crisp air of late autumn carried the scent of pine and freshly fallen leaves as Grace stood in the small cemetery, gazing at the headstone that bore her mother's name. The granite was smooth and cool under her fingertips, the engraved letters catching the light of the fading afternoon sun. In her hand, she held a bouquet of white lilies, her mother's favorite, and beside her, Charlie sat quietly, his golden fur glowing in the soft light. It had been 6 months since the wedding, 6 months of joy and laughter, tears and hard conversations, growth and healing. Grace felt a calmness now, a sense of peace she hadn't fully understood on the day she stood in the garden exchanging vows with Andrew. The journey since then had been far from perfect, but it had been her snow, theirs. Hers and Andrew's. Together, they had taken the broken pieces of their past and begun crafting a new story. She knelt down, placing the bouquet at the base of the headstone. "Hi, Mom," she whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of love and longing. "It's been a while. I hope you've been watching over us." The cemetery was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant chirping of birds. Grace's thoughts drifted as she traced the letters of her mother's name, recalling the woman who had been her anchor, her guide, and now, her guardian from beyond. So much had changed since she had read those letters on her wedding day. Her mother's voice, preserved in ink, had given her the courage to confront truths she hadn't been ready to face. It was her mother's strength and love that had ultimately led Grace to make the choices she had. Charlie whined softly, nudging her arm. She smiled, scratching behind his ears. "You're always here for me, aren't you?" she said. He wagged his tail, his quiet companionship a constant comfort. Behind her, footsteps crunched on the gravel path. Grace turned to see Andrew approaching, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. His hair was slightly tousled from the wind, and his eyes softened as they met hers. He carried a small box in his hands, wrapped in simple brown paper and tied with a string. "Thought I'd find you here," he said, his voice warm and steady. He crouched beside her, placing the box on the grass. "I brought something." Grace tilted her head, curious. "What is it?" Andrew smiled, untied the string, and opened the box. Inside was a journal, its leather cover worn but beautiful. "It's for you," he said. "I thought maybe you want to start writing your own letters. For the future." Grace's throat tightened as she ran her fingers over the journal's cover. "It's perfect," she whispered. She looked at Andrew, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've been so strong, Grace. And I want to make sure we keep building something together, something honest, something real. I thought writing could be a way to keep connecting, even when things get hard." Grace nodded, her heart swelling. It was a kind of gesture that reminded her why she had chosen him, why she had fought for their relationship despite the shadows of the past. They had worked tirelessly over the past months to rebuild trust, to open up about the things they had once hidden. Andrew had shared more about his father, about the man who had caused so much pain for Grace's mother. He had faced his own guilt and fear, and together, they had begun to make peace with their complicated histories. She turned back to her mother's headstone, the journal clutched in her hands. "I think she'd be proud of us," Grace said softly. "Of how far we've come." Andrew nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder. "She would be. She'd be proud of you, especially." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around them. Grace closed her eyes, imagining it as her mother's embrace, a silent acknowledgement of everything she had endured and achieved. She felt lighter in that moment, as if she were finally letting go of the last remnants of pain that had lingered since her wedding day. As they left the cemetery, hand in hand, Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose. She glanced down at the journal, already thinking of what she would write. Perhaps she would begin with a letter to her future self, or maybe to the children she and Andrew hoped to have one day. She wanted to tell them about love, not the fairy tale kind, but the real kind, the kind that required effort and patience, forgiveness and courage. Back at their home, The smell of fresh-baked bread filled the air, accompanying warmth against the crisp evening chill. Grace slipped out of her coat and hung it by the door, Charlie trotting in after her and curling up on his favorite spot by the fireplace. Andrew busied himself in the kitchen, humming softly as he stirred a pot of soup on the stove. Their home was a modest but cozy cottage on the edge of a small town, surrounded by rolling hills and fields of wildflowers. It was a far cry from the grand estate where they had married, but it felt like home in a way that no other place ever had. They had chosen it together, wanting a fresh start, a space that was wholly theirs. As Andrew finished setting the table, Grace placed a journal on the sideboard and joined him in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, watching him with a smile. "You're getting pretty good at this cooking thing," she teased. He grinned, ladling soup into bowls. "I've had a good teacher," he said, leaning over to kiss her on the forehead. "Besides, it's the least I can do after everything you've done for us." They sat down to eat, their conversation flowing easily as they talked about their day, their plans for the week, and their dreams for the future. Grace felt a deep contentment settle over her, a sense that they were exactly where they were meant to be. After dinner, they curled up on the couch together, the fire casting a warm glow over the room. Andrew pulled out an old photo album, one they had started together, and flipped through the pages. The images told the story of their life, since the wedding weekend hikes with Charlie, quiet nights by the fire, laughter-filled dinners with friends. "This," Andrew said, pointing to a picture of them standing by a lake with Charlie splashing in the water, "is what I want for the rest of my life. Just us, together, making memories." Grace rested her head on his shoulder, her heart full. "Me too," she said. "This is all I need." As the fire crackled and the evening wore on, Grace felt a quiet sense of closure. The journey that had begun with heartbreak and uncertainty had led her here, to a life of love, resilience, and hope. She had learned that the past could shape her, but it didn't have to define her. And with Andrew by her side, she knew they could face whatever the future held. She reached for the journal on the side table, opening it to the first page. With a steady hand, she began to write. "Dear Mom, today I visited you, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. I miss you every day, but I feel your love guiding me, even now. I hope you're proud of the choices I've made, of the life Andrew and I are building together. It's not perfect, but it's ours, and it's beautiful in its own way. Thank you for teaching me how to love, how to forgive, and how to be strong. I'll carry those lessons with me always, and I promise to honor your memory in everything I do. With all my love." Grace, she set the pen down, her heart lighter than it had been in months. As she closed the journal and curled up beside Andrew, she realized that this was her new beginning, a life filled with love, shaped by the past but not bound by it, and built on a foundation of trust and hope.